Go ahead and kind of shift gears and jump into why I asked you to talk with me today. So when I met Professor Cheney, I was married uh, and had been married for a while. And now I've entered the single world, and man, it is such a different space. But as you mentioned, I mean, I have such a passion about the Black community in general, but also Black relationships, Black marriage. I'm not bitter on Black marriages despite my divorce. And then looking at the what is happening in our single space with Black America, and there's so much different controversy or different viewpoints on what is happening in our community when it comes to dating, relationships, and our future. And I always tell people we cannot be pro-Black, we cannot even be talk about Black wealth without talking about Black marriages, without talking about Black relationships, because the income increases as you get married. So, when we talk about Black wealth, it's easier to build Black wealth when we are coupled together, as two, or however, people want to do that. But when you marry, it increases the likelihood of you increasing that income. And so, of course, it's the single parenting and all the other things that make it more challenging for us to be able to advance, certainly because your income is now being split into different homes as opposed to being in one home. And so I think, again, when we see a big pro-Black movement, Black Lives Matter, but I think we cannot be passionate about these issues without being passionate about Black relationships, without being passionate about Black families, and what is the state of Black families right now. And so I know you've done some research on that. And so if you want to just start out and kind of share, maybe we can start out maybe just talking about I don't know if you want to talk about statistics first.
Yeah,
Okay.
statistics, I think it's always like a great place to start in terms of the numbers, right? So when you look at according to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, um, during 2018, all racial and ethnic groups had increases in marriage, right?
Mm.
So when we're talking about all racial and ethnic groups, we're talking about Caucasians, we're talking about Hispanics, we're talking about Native Americans, and we're talking about Asians and
Mm.
Pacific Islanders, right? So essentially, when we're talking about like the marriage to divorce ratio, right? It was actually during 2018, it was 2 to 2. So
Mm-hmm.
that means that there was slightly more than two marriages for every one divorce, right? So as I mentioned before, for all the ethnic, racial and ethnic groups, there were actually more marriages than there were divorces,
That's good. Mm-hmm.
were all except Black women,
Mm.
right? So Black women were the only group that had that actually had a higher divorce rate than marriage rate
Mm.
during 2018. So nearly, it was essentially 31 divorces for every 1,000 marriages. And like according to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, they count that as women that started age 15, right, and older, right? So I think that in itself puts African Americans in a very precarious situation when it comes to marriage. So, but in addition to that, we're looking at the numbers, right? Only 29% of African Americans are married.
Mm.
So when you look at only 29% are married, the, when compared with whites, Hispanics, Asians, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, we're more likely to get divorced,
Mm.
right? So just what that shows is that we have a very low likelihood of marrying, but even when we marry, we have a higher likelihood of getting
The divorce.
divorced,
Mm.
right? So either way, right, African Americans are in this very, very precarious situation when it comes to marriage. So this is the reason why like I mentioned before, the book that I'm currently writing on characteristics of strong Black marriages. They
Mm-hmm.
are actually out there,
Right.
right? Even though they are much rarer than they are among, whites generally,
Mm-hmm.
which make up the majority of the population, right? But they are still out there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there. I think a very very interesting place for Black women
Right.
be in. Um, and, I remember, like, Portia, when we talked about this, I said, well, we can't talk about the low marriage rates among Black women and not mention the mass incarceration of Black men,
Yeah.
right? So Black men have like 5.1% for chance of being incarcerated during their life compared to white men,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you look at incarceration in the United States, no other country in the world incarcerates people at the rate that we do,
Right.
right? But of that number, there's a disproportionate number of African American men that are in prison. So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes when we talk about what do you mean like disproportionate, right? So when you look at blacks only make up 13.4% of the US population,
Right.
right? But they make up over half of the individuals that are in our nation's prisons,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that actually diminishes the marriage pool for a lot
Right.
of Black women considerably, right? You have all these men that have been incarcerated, even the ones once they leave prison, there's so many jobs that they cannot get, right? So
Mm-hmm.
many benefits in society that are denied them because of their incarcerated status.
Right. And I know that, it's just so much that the challenge that must present, not only on the struggle that they went through, but then the role of a man to be the provider. And so you have this pressure and this, expectation to be able to provide in a society that does everything in its power to oppress you the most. And even the ones who don't go to prison, their journey through trying to find their path and trying to figure out what it is they're going to do, and then trying to make the money that is due them, even when they have the qualities, can be very challenging. And that level of pressure and the impact of it, I can't imagine, the impact to me. I think, there's still a lot of impact on the oppression in America and the results that we're seeing in our marriages, including whether it's our education disparities, mental health disparities, because all of those things impact the way we interact with one another. And so when we come with extra challenges, extra pressure, our children being in school, and they're more likely to be targeted as issues, more likely to struggle. Then you come home to those struggles, that there are so many different pressures that impact our relationships. And then, when you're in the single world, it's trying to figure out, what do I focus on? Am I focusing on trying to build wealth? Am I trying to get out of the struggle? Am I trying to get to a certain point, before I bring someone into my world? Because I think right now we're in a space where everyone kind of, we're talking more about get yourself together first.
Yes.
And in that space, I think sometimes the reality of what does that really mean, because some people, I think, then take it so literal that they have to be perfect to be in this space. How do we get there mentally, emotionally, financially, and be able to bring someone else into that world? I mean, there's just so many challenges as a community that we're facing. And then when you hear conversations, it's so much, it seems like animosity against each, gender. The men have things that they have to say about the women, and the women have things to say about the men. And I don't know if there's anything if you can want to reply to any of that. Because I know it's not really about the research, but that's just in general some things that I've maybe noticed.
You know what? I concur with everything that you said, Portia. African Americans compared to whites have more challenges,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's not to say that that white people do not, and white people and Hispanic people and Native Americans and Asians and Pacific Islanders do not have challenges. However, the challenges of African Americans are distinct in the sense that we were the only racial and ethnic group that were forcibly brought to the United States,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that automatically did not put African Americans on the same playing field
Right.
as it did other groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at it from a historical perspective, African Americans' homes were more likely to be separated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, the fathers and the mothers were sold to different plantations, right? So you had some slave owners that were like, okay, we're going to keep them all, as a family, but it was not uncommon for African American mothers and fathers to be separated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that caused like a huge void, I think, for a lot of children not to have their father be present.
Right.
So I think unbeknownst to many African Americans that really want to be in relationships, right? That they actually want to be present in the lives of their children. Oftentimes, I have found in my work, they just don't know how to do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? They don't know what a healthy relationship looks like.
Yeah.
What a healthy parent-child bond looks like. And earlier, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I
Mm-hmm.
would like to say Black marriages matter.
Yes. Yes.
Black marriages most certainly matter. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was a graduate student, the African American Healthy Marriage Initiative was very, very active. So
Mm-hmm.
former President, the former President Bush's, right, daddy and son Bush, right, they were very, very committed to advancing work that actually made community stronger. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of that community strength focus was focusing on marriages, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
for them, I mean, the basic unit of human society is not the community, it's the family.
Yeah.
But it's really not the family, it's the marriage. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the strength of the marriage oftentimes determines the strength of the family, which determines the strength of the community, which determines the strength of the nation, right? So I was very dismayed to see that when President Obama came in office, all of that funding went away.
Oh wow.
And since that time, I've been hoping that someone would actually bring it back
Mm-hmm.
because with all of the stressors that families are going through now, dealing with this pandemic, right? We're in
Mm-hmm.
the wake of that. And in addition to that, a lot of families are now finding themselves kind of in an economically stressed space.
Yeah.
That makes that makes research on marriages and marriage strengthening, I believe, in my opinion, all the more important now
Yeah.
than what they were before the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
right? But um, there's just not enough work. I think national. I would like to see more of a national focus
Yeah.
on strengthening Black families, Black
Right.
marriages in particular.
And so when we look at that and we're talking about singleness and what are some of the challenges that you've seen as it relates to African Americans and their in and being single and their dating and how they're choosing mates and what that process is like.
Oh goodness, do we have enough time to really get into this? Wow. Where do I start? Um, I'm gonna start from the beginning. Is what I'm gonna call it.
Mhm.
And for me, the beginning is our formative years. It's something this is like the great equalizer, right? So everyone is going through the formative years that in the research says it's from birth to age 5,
Mhm.
right? So if a person had a very stable home life from birth to age 5, right? Meaning that their parents, were together.
Mm-hmm.
Their parents were very attentive to their needs, right? So this is actually when something, according to John Bowlby, this is when children develop what they call attachments, either secure attachments or insecure attachments. So secure attachments, which are optimal for happy, healthy, and stable relationships,
Mm-hmm.
is from a very young age. When you need something, your caretaker provides it for you,
Right.
right? So when your diaper needs to be changed and you're feeling uncomfortable in that dirty diaper, and
Mm-hmm.
you cry, and someone actually tends to you, changes your diaper. When you are hungry, right, and someone gives you something to eat. When you want to be coddled, and someone comes and picks you up and rocks you to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
From a very young age, your brain is becoming wired. So this is why the birth to age 5 is so important, because children that really get that during those formative years, they develop secure attachments. So as they age, they go out into the world confident that if I need something, someone is going to
Yeah.
be there to provide it for me,
Yeah.
right? But the unfortunate reality is that so many people are not reared in secure households. They
Mm-hmm.
might have received maybe, a roof over their head, food in their stomach, right? But that security is something that they never got.
And I want to state when you're saying that even when we have two-parent households, that you may not get that, because I was in a two-parent household. But those were some of the things that were challenging for my parents to give me because of their experience and things that they did not receive from their parents. And so they did not know how to give. They gave me better than what they had, but they did not know how to emotionally give me the different things that I needed in that space. And of course, we worked through it through the years, but that was something that we had to grow to and learn later, but I did not get it right away. And of course there's impacts to that, but I just want to kind of make that mention, because sometimes we think we're safe because we're married, but you still have to do the work even when you're married, to be attentive, to be alert, and to be present, and that you did not just solve the problem by just being married.
Excellent point. Excellent point, Portia. I definitely agree with that. So I think a lot of it, and like you're mentioning a situation where you didn't get the amount of emotional connectedness that you really should have received, right? Even your parents, you mentioned, did the best that they could,
Hmm.
but kind of compare that to many African Americans have actually been reared in very traumatic
Right.
households, right? Where they have actually experienced verbal abuse, right? Which oftentimes the law, right, tends not to regard as highly because there are no physical
Hmm.
bruises, right? But I believe it is just as detrimental,
Hmm.
right, as physical abuse. So physical abuse, some are dealing with like sexual abuse,
Hmm.
right? And these are boys and girls that
Hmm.
are dealing with these issues, right? During either not during their formative years, during their elementary and middle school years, right? Um, these are some of the issues that many of them are dealing with. So
Hmm.
it has caused, I think, a lot of African Americans just to have a lot of the distrust portion that you were talking about earlier,
Hmm.
of women looking at black men with distrust,
Yeah.
black men looking at black women with distrust,
Hmm.
right? I think a lot of it is because of the issues that they dealt with when they were young. Many of them even dealt with even parents that maybe were neglectful. So
Yeah.
they didn't beat you, right? They didn't curse you. They just were absent,
Hmm.
right? Or they took care of their own needs. They made their own needs a priority over the needs of their children. So
Hmm.
I think that's one. I mean, when I said I'm going to go back to the earliest thing, I think I mean, looking at the childhood environment, I think is so, so very important.
Hmm.
Um, think another thing is a lot of people look at social media, right? I think social media, it has made people feel that they have to present their life, not only their relationships, but their lives in a certain way. And we don't know oftentimes what's really going on behind closed doors, right? So it's like people are kind of running behind an illusion of what they think a relationship should be.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, even in addition to that, is most Black people do not have a strong model of what a healthy relationship
Yeah.
looks like.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know.
Right.
Because we don't have it in our families, in
Mm-hmm.
our communities, right? So more often than not, just I mean, I always tell my students in terms of like think about what these numbers mean.
Mm-hmm.
So if 70% of Black children are reared in single parent households, that means that more often than not, if you were to stop a random Black person, that person would actually have been reared by a single parent,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or born to a single parent,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a lot of it is we just don't have an example
Right.
of what a healthy relationship looks like. I think another thing that comes into play is unrealistic expectation.
Mm.
Um, a lot of people think that when you get married, things are supposed to be perfect. I don't know where that's in fairy tales. That
Mm-hmm.
that that is the only place that happens. And in my interviewing over 100 married couples, they will tell you there were times we hated each other's guts.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them might even say we even separated for a
Mm-hmm.
minute, right? So marriages are just not this kind of even keel. You're happy all the time. You're not going to deal with any challenges, right? And I think a lot of people feel that the minute that the challenges come, that means that's not the person you're supposed to be with.
Right. We need to stay there for a minute because I'm like,
No.
that's where we are in society in general, whether it's friendships, whether it's partnerships, whether it is, any level of conflict. We're in this season of, because again, we talked about, in some regards, there are people who are talking about mental health and they're prioritizing their mental health. I don't have to deal with this. And, to me, I feel like you can't just say we're dealing with mental health by cutting everybody off, because I need I'm not going to let anybody disturb my peace. And I mean, that's not necessarily what mental health is. And the other fact is there is mental health that is, a part of this impact that we're talking about, a lot of untreated mental health, especially in the Black community. And so when we don't understand mental health too, that's also going to be part of those challenges when it makes it difficult to adapt to people. But regardless of mental health or not, my point, but based on what you were saying, it's just the fact that we don't know how to stick with things and stick with challenges. Only time I see us doing it is with work. But when it comes to overcoming the emotional challenges and doing, because a lot of it requires a lot of inner work. And so it's because you can't change other people. So when those challenges come, a lot of times we have to look within and see the things that we can do to kind of help change or impact the situation or grow, because we can never control the other person. And then sometimes it may be waiting it out, faith, different things, giving another person time to grow, understanding that we're not always going to see eye to eye, that there are other impacts on that individual, that may be impacting their behavior towards us, or they're, like you said, they're rearing different things that they're growing out of. And so I just think that's such an important point of, and how, and it's a fine line, but trying figuring out how much of it, like, how do I know when to stay and continue to pursue and work through things? And when do I know enough is enough? But I do believe, like you said, that we give up too soon, that we see challenges, whether it's dating, whether it is even in our, looking for a mate. And like you said, the expectations. There are certain things that I hear people say, I'm not trying to deal with certain things, but some of the things that they're mentioning, like maybe this person is a little, and this may be a big deal to some people, maybe they're a little more They're not as neat and organized. But if you come into the home, and even if y'all pay an organizer, or you have, maybe they never had organization, that's something that maybe potentially, not everybody, but potentially could be easily fixed if they're not a hoarder, or, something extreme, that they just may not have had exposure or the help to figure out a system that works for them. And now you done threw the whole person away, or maybe it's the way they dress. Doesn't, and now of course it may not, if it's extreme, I'm not talking about extremes, but it's something that could be generally, when you're with someone, you can both kind of grow together in the way that you dress and the way that you carry yourself. And I'm not talking about inappropriate or anything. I just mean maybe it's just not your style. But that's something that could, easily be fixed. Like maybe they've been holding back on their money because they're so focused on everything else. They really haven't focused on their outward appearance or attire, hair, appearance. All that stuff is something that can be easily fixed if they're willing. Now, I'm not saying force it, anything like that if they want to. But those are minimal changes. But of course, there are bigger things that we deal with that I think people struggle with as well.
Right. And that's such an important point, Portia. We throw in the towel much too quickly in our society. I mean, we're like a microwavable society, and
Mm-hmm.
our relationships are microwavable, right? They got to be quick, right? They got to be satisfying to us, right? And if not, we disregard it. And I think the unfortunate thing about that is, and this actually goes back to, I mean, goes way back to like 1970, right? Was when no fault divorce came onto the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So before 1970, both people actually had to agree to a divorce,
Mm.
right? And it had to be something of serious concern. So it had to be like physical abuse, right? It had to be like, infidelity, right? Those were actual grounds for divorce. Former President Reagan in 1970 came out with something called no fault divorce, right? So after that, and you can't say like it's cause and effect, but it's highly correlated, right? That, in the decade that followed that, from 1970 right to 1980, you saw this huge spike in divorces because what that pretty much opened up a Pandora's box to where only one person that wanted out could easily get out.
Mm.
Whereas as opposed to both people actually coming to the decision to divorce, only one person could say that they wanted out. What's interesting in terms of marriage research is that a lot of people that get divorced, they also go on to remarry,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what the statistics also found, National Center for Marriage and Research finds that generally when people, the more remarriages that a person has, the lower their likelihood of actually staying together,
Mm.
right? So I think that goes to the kind of flawed thinking of, okay, this person isn't working, I'll get it right with this person.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But this, whatever issues you dealt with this person, and you're in this part, you're in a new relationship, you're just going to be dealing with new issues.
Yeah.
That person. It's not that that person's not going to have issues, right? But perhaps maybe if you kind of put more effort into working, on your marriage. Another thing that was found, like in terms of, um, I remember reading a study, and I remember I was in grad school then, and I will find this study, and anyone that's interested, I will send you the link because I don't believe in just like
Throwing stuff.
spewing out stats and like not
Mm-hmm.
having something to back it up. I remember reading this, and I want to say it was by Strauss and Gellis, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been a minute. But they found that 7 years after couples divorce, in fact, it wasn't even 7 years. I think the average, I think the max, like the range was like 2 to 7 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they found that the overwhelming majority of people, Portia, that after they got divorced, they said that they regretted the divorce.
Mm-hmm.
right? And some of these folks, some of them were still single, but some of them were even married.
Mm-hmm.
So what that shows is that I think the ones that abandoned their first marriage to get into something else that they thought would be because it's shiny and it's
Mm-hmm.
new, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you haven't spent as much time with the person to really
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of their flaws because we
Right.
all have them, right? But I think what that says is that the folks that get into something else, they're realizing, wait a minute, I just traded one sort of issues for another sort of issue.
Right.
That's one thing. But then also, in addition to that, my goodness, what I had before was actually better
Right.
than what I'm in now.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, one of the things I really wish that every state would do is to have some type of mediation with couples before they divorce.
Mm.
I think that's so, especially where children are involved, but even where children are not involved, I think it's so important, right, to help kind of people see the big picture
Yeah.
because I think when you're only looking for problems, right, all you're going to see is the problems. But sometimes you need to kind of look back and look at the big
Mm-hmm.